Welcome back. Gentlemen, you mentioned earlier that the budget didn't penalize any group or segment of society, but they did do anything for the business sector of Malaysia. Is that, there's a feeling that there wasn't much being announced in terms of alleviating the pressure that's not only faced by the consumer, but possibly even businesses. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, first of all, I thought that the budget, quite rightly said, did not specifically penalize business. In fact, something that they introduced was in the form of increase in the level of group relief that could be granted to companies from 50% to 70% of the losses for the year. Whilst that was good, I suppose the question is how many, what's the segment of the business sector that actually makes use of this particular relief. I guess there are two other areas that seem to point out like a sore thumb that could potentially cause a lot of heartache to businesses, especially in the areas of withholding taxes and reinvestment allowances.
That's right. Yeah, I think whilst yes, there's been no specific, if you like, relief for lots of companies, but I think the good news is that I think the government is beginning to realize that corporate social responsibility activities are very much a parcel of corporate life these days, and they've been, if you like, fairly generous in the deductions for this. I think first of all, in terms of the definition of what qualifies for corporate social responsibility project has been extended to include projects related to the increase of income of the poor, as well as for conservation or preservation of the environment. I think those are a very positive move. And the fact that they've also now increased the, if you like, the deductibility of approved donations from 7% of aggregate income to 10%, I think again is a very positive move. Well, my only wish was that the increase from 7 to 10% was also extended to individuals who obviously also would like to contribute, but are now capped at 7%.
Okay.
But I suppose aside from the slight the wordings and the reinvestment allowances and that of group relief, which is clearly an increase of tax rate with increase in the rate of relief. Certain other administrative things are not addressed, but beyond that, there are attempts to try to ease, the compliance of tax reporting. There are also, I think, attempts to try to streamline some of the the obligations of company reporting in the budget. So in that sense, it attempts to make it business friendly. I think what's surprising is there were some expectations that certain industries would be faced with an increase in tax rates. For instance, the gaming, that didn't come true, and it's it's good news in that sense. But just going back 2 months, you find that in fact the companies which are perceived to have done well, the oil and gas, the plantations, the IPP, already there were taxes introduced, known as excess levies, which would affect them. But for this budget, it appears that there is no additional taxes for businesses generally. Yeah.
Okay.
A very good move for Malaysia is in relation to advanced pricing arrangements, because the top problem which tax directors worldwide face is on transfer pricing, and this particularly in Asia Pacific. So we now expect that rules regarding APAs will be introduced, and this will grant companies investing in Malaysia, as well as Malaysian companies, certainty that their transfer prices will be respected by the Inland Revenue for a period of 3 to 5 years. So the Inland Revenue has generally accepted the prices around the median range, but with an advanced pricing arrangement, we hope that they will accept pricing and operational margins in the interquartile ranges as well, and this will give certainty to businessmen. So that's a very good move for Malaysia as well as for businesses.
All right. Okay. I suppose the surprise was that beer wasn't taxed, but tobacco was, and if you're a smoker, you're going to face higher costs. But in general, does the budget itself and the measures proposed by the government alleviate some of the cost pressures faced by the ministry? I think some of the measures announced address that of the lower income group in terms of direct welfare payments and reduction or in terms of payments on monthly electricity bills. Is there anything more that you gentlemen would like to add on that?
As regards the duty reductions, it's good that at the customs, at the import point, duty is being reduced. But I think government needs to work towards that saving being passed on to the end consumer. And that really is the intention, and to see that that is really implemented.
Okay.
I think the man on the street, especially those in the workforce, well, they do, or they are receiving quite a fair bit of benefits, bits and pieces here and there, insofar as exemptions on perquisites, allowances on travelling, you know. So it does end up being how we call a situation whereby, apart from the administrative part that Kenneth was mentioning about, there is additional disposable income certainly in their pockets, which hopefully, you know, goes to alleviate some of the problems which they now face.
Okay.
I think if you look at most households, their largest purchase, you know, other than the car, would be the house. And you know, one would expect that there would have been more relief in terms of housing, especially in terms of interest on housing loans. Unfortunately, this was a feature that was quite well, I mean, was widely anticipated, but not in the budget. So I think, you know, yes, there's been some relief, but I think in terms of the, if you like, the big items, big ticket items for households, you know, perhaps less of a relief.
Okay.
Yeah, I suppose if I move up the wealth chain, to move from perhaps the lower income to the middle income, although there are attempts to relieve you know, the burden caused by increased prices on the middle income, I actually would have you know, be more pleased if there was greater reliefs for the traditional child allowances and what have you, which continues to be at 1,000 per child, and also personal reliefs. You know, it would have been a nice gesture if that those reliefs are given, you know, and increased, but that didn't quite happen.
All right.
There are some reliefs in costs. In terms of tax costs, we are now allowed to self-amend the tax returns. So if there was an error in a return and that return had been submitted, then upon discovery there would be a penalty of between 15 to 45%. Hefty, 15 to 45. But now there's a one-time opportunity within a period of 6 months of submission to amend the tax return without penalty, save for penalties on late payment of tax.
All right. So you won't get penalized if you made an error.
That's right.
Okay. But you know, in terms of the fiscal deficit, I think most of us were quite surprised to see a number of 4.8% being announced by the Prime Minister. You know, that's all despite the higher petroleum revenue the government's receiving and also the windfall taxes that it's collecting. Is there a concern that the government is overspending?
Well, I think I wouldn't say overspending, but I think, you know, a lot of this expenditure that the government has been put on in terms of like public transportation, the increasing the development budget, I think it's necessary. But I think the greater challenge would be that the government has also announced that they will reduce the deficit. It's a one-off. It was indicated by our Honourable Prime Minister, to then reduce it to about 3.6% next year. And the question now is then, despite, you know, all this, how are they going to do it? And is that an indication that next year's budget is perhaps not less expansionary, or is it an indication that there could be new taxes like the GST that's been talked about and widely anticipated to be introduced in some form, in some form in time? So I think these are the questions that probably also needs to be questioned.
Okay.
I look at the tax collections as reported in the papers for this year, or the budgeted collections that we're looking at, and it's actually going into the 80 billion category, and that's an increase over the previous year. So, despite perhaps the surpluses from the petrol prices, rising out of petrol prices, the deficit has gone up. Therefore, it's a very expansionary kind of budget. But if you ask me, is it a big departure from what was anticipated? I think it was about 3.8%. Indeed, it is quite a big departure, and therefore, yes, the deficit has gone up quite dramatically, and therefore, it's a concern.
All right. Okay. With that, we'll take another short break, and we'll be right back. Thank you.